Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today for the Asian Banker teleconsultation session. I apologize for the delay. We will now get right into the teleconsultation. Before I begin, let me just quickly say two things about specific notes that you should bear in mind. During the last section of this discussion, we will allow all the people who have logged in to ask questions. However, you may want to write those questions down on the chat screen, which is on your screen right now, and send it over to me. I will then post those questions to the speakers. That was the first point. And secondly, please note that the proceedings report for today's session, along with the important slides that are being used for this, will be posted on the Asian Bankers Data and Analytics Working Group within 4 days after the call. Now, without further ado, let me begin this discussion. First of all, let me introduce to you the Data and Analytics Working Group, which is a part of the various working groups that the Asian Banker has. And as a part of that, we have initiated this exercise called the One Big Question. The One Big Question is a series of 4 teleconsultations and polls that will be launched one every quarter, during which we will try to answer one pressing business question, which will help bankers across Asia Pacific find solutions to something that they're looking for in their real business scenarios. As you all know, in choosing the first topic for the One Big Question, we decided to talk about big data. And we've been hearing a lot about big data across various industries, in retail, in social media, in websites, everywhere, including financial services. And it was hence that we decided that the topic that we need to now talk about with our users, with our readers and subscribers, was whether big data is actually a true phenomenon or a consultant buzzword. And that is the topic for today. So the process of the One Big Question was that once the questions were posed online, we got your responses in the form of a yes and no. We got your comments, which were very invaluable in this exercise. And now, as a part of this teleconsultation session, we have invited 2 very eminent speakers to talk to us about these critical trends and explain to us what they think is the right path for banks, whether it is a consultant buzzword, how it can be prioritized, and where we are in this journey towards big data. Let me introduce to you our speakers. One of our key speakers today is Edwin Yuan. Edwin is the Chief Analytics Officer for Bank of China in Hong Kong, where he has been instrumental in implementing various database projects over the last 5 years. Recently, he was also voted as the Risk Manager of the Year. Prior to that, he was the Head of Risk Analytics for Standard Chartered Bank and will today speak to us about big data from the point of view of implementation. Then we will have Vincent Leet. Vince is a seasoned ex-banker. He worked with an Australian bank for over 25 years across various departments, including product development, strategy, cards, and marketing. Currently, he is the banking and financial markets leader for ASEAN at IBM, where he helps banks across Asia and Middle East transform their CRM, marketing, and business intelligence functions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we did this survey online, and I will put up that slide now, which will give you the survey results about what you as bankers across Asia Pacific said about the question, is big data a real phenomenon or is it a buzzword for consultant analytics? So let me put up the slide now. Okay. So as I said, now after the opinion poll was posted online, and we also did interviews with a lot of bankers across the region. My first slide clearly indicates that about 2/3 of the respondents believe that big data is a real phenomenon. And this unequivocally tells us that people around the region do understand the need for big data in financial services. However, this was just one part of the poll, and we wanted to go a little deeper into it, and hence we talked to bankers across the region over telephonic discussions, and we found some surprising results as a part of that discussion. Firstly, we realized that while large banks agree with the trend that big data is essential for surviving in the competitive landscape of banking that is today, it is the mid-sized banks across the region that are more tuned to it, that are more receptive to the idea. And as you can see in this graph, large banks are, as I said, agree to the trend around 60-65%, whereas medium-sized banks agree to the trend up to around 80%, which clearly indicates that these banks are hungry for innovation, are looking for ideas to maybe become a large bank in the near future. And this is a trend which is not counterintuitive, but is essential to understanding the acceptance of a new trend like big data. Digging a little deeper, we looked at the kind of people in the organizations who are looking at understanding big data, and we found another surprise. And the surprise was that senior managers in these organizations do not consider big data a phenomenon, whereas mid-level managers who are actually dealing with problems on a day-to-day basis on the front end and at the back end do consider big data as a phenomenon. Now, this does mean that it might slow down its implementation. It might have various implications for banks on how they accept this trend. Now, these three slides, although give you a paradoxical view of the poll and the results, the next slide gives you a clear understanding of the issues that bankers today are grappling with in understanding big data. And these are some quotes that bankers talked about when we talked to them, and you will see that they have a very interesting ring to them. First of all, a Singapore bank said that big data can be really insightful if you know how to use it. The key word, as you all can understand, is if you know how to use it. Then RHB Bank said that not every bank is at the stage where it is ready to tap into big data. Now, it's a long journey and we need to figure out where we are, where we need to go. One of the very interesting online comments was with regard to prioritization. Given the fact that banks in Asia are now in a completely different light with respect to growth, etc., is big data oxygen for the banks to survive, or is it low priority? We had a comment from AmBank which said that it's simply a matter of time before we recognize the potential that big data offers. While that is true, two of the most important comments that we received were with regard to clear ROI. Public Bank said that they do not see a clear relationship between big data and actual profits, while a global bank mentioned that there seems to be a lot of hype around it. While it is a real phenomena, maybe the hype is being overdone. So it is these few points that we would like to talk about today with our speakers and understand from them their viewpoint of the question whether this is a real phenomenon or a consultant buzzword, and if so, what can banks do to make sure that they are up the curve in achieving that. Now that I've quickly given you a quick introduction of the topic and the survey, let me hand over to Vince. Vince, as I mentioned, has a lot of experience in having implemented CRM-based projects across the region, and he will talk to us today about what big data really is. To give you a background, maybe there is a perception issue, maybe there's an issue of understanding, and he will then explain to us about the projects that he sees happening in the region today. So, Vince, if you can hear me, please, the floor is yours, and I have put up the slides.
Good afternoon, Arun. Thank you very much for the introduction. To the audience, I'm in a remote location, so Arun's going to run the slides for me from the Asian banker offices. So thanks very much for taking the time to be with us today. I'm from the IBM organization, and we see big data as a very real issue today. We see that big data is something that the banking community in this region and globally needs to start thinking about how they're going to leverage and exploit big data to improve the customer experience, improve the way they manage risk, and the way they go about managing operations. So, Arun, if you could go to slide number 2. I think the issue around big data is that it's all kinds of data. There's enormous volumes out there. There's data today that we really hadn't thought about even a couple of years ago, and it's coming from a variety of places. And the key thing is its variety. It's structured and predominantly unstructured data. There's huge volumes of this data, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And the velocity of this data, it's coming at you at great speeds, real-time speeds. It has a very short lifespan. For many organisations, they need to be able to analyse and act on this data in real time. So if we go to the next slide, there's just so much data out there today. As the slide says, 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. I mean, if you think about even in our own personal lives, the amount of data that we're consuming, it's enormous. And it's not only the traditional structured data, there's all of this unstructured data that we're seeing that's coming to our desktops, our laptops, our mobile devices as consumers, let alone what's happening in our business life. And if you think about the sort of data that's coming to us each day in our business life, for bankers, for the banking audience, how do you actually harness, assemble that data and then start to manage that data and then start to exploit that data? It's a challenge. And the data on slide 4, it's coming from everywhere. Just the numbers. I mean, these numbers are out of date right now, because the volumes have grown even more. But you've got big numbers of Twitter, Facebook, and we talk about our region, the ASEAN region, but we've got the Philippines, we've got Indonesia. The consumers of those markets are huge users of Facebook and Twitter. So the consumers are using it. How are bankers tapping into that? You look at the number of camera phones there are worldwide, RFID tags, GPS-enabled devices. There's just millions and millions and millions of these devices out there that are generating structured and unstructured data. That, as a banker, there is a need for bankers to be aware of what's happening out there. The next slide talks about, the fact that big data is a new resource, but it's interesting. We all consume media of some sort, but I'm seeing articles in mainstream press and in the mainstream consumer forums around big data. And, so the journalists are picking up, not even the financial journalists, but, or the technical journalists, but mainstream journalists are talking about big data. And today, we're talking about databases that can be up to 10,000 times bigger than your typical database. So we talk about petaflops and petascale. And there's a need there for appliances, the right sort of appliances to be able to help organisations like banks cope with this data. So we go to the next slide. It actually brings, our view is that big data brings new opportunities. Now, those new opportunities do require new analytics, but there's opportunities out there for organisations to analyse data to help, as we say in the slide here, help improve security, help improve promotions, help improve the way organisations manage customers, manage risk, manage their operations. But the pressure is on the banks and organisations to be able to handle these large volumes of data, but also be able to do it at speed. You can't, there's no longer T+7 or T+14. You've got to be looking at nearly the ability to be able to analyse this data real time. And the next slide talks about, that there are solutions being built today that will support this for organisations like banks. And it's going to help banks around areas like, better product development, deeper customer insight. It's going to help them with their services, their efficiency, cost control. It's going to help in terms of training your staff. It's going to help organisations in terms of, non-bank organisations in terms of things like security, managing risk, managing responses. But there's a lot of capability that can be harnessed by organisations if they start looking at how are we going to plan for and start leveraging big data in our organisation. The next slide is about the IBM challenge of Jeopardy that took place last year in 2011. And I'm not sure how many of the audience know about this, but for IBM's 100th birthday, we embarked on a program to build Watson. And Watson was designed primarily to take on two contestants in a game show called Jeopardy. And the Jeopardy game show is quite famous, but it requires speed, because the contestants, most of the contestants that operate in these game shows, constantly hit the buzzer. Their view is that they will know the answer to about 85% of the questions. So they're constantly hitting the buzzer. So the IBM Watson needed to be able to analyze all the information that it was being given in terms of the question, digest that, and then respond with an answer. And on the next slide, you can see there that it had to process unstructured and text data in 3 seconds, and that the machine had to be taught about gaming strategy. So the ability for Watson to score and measure money against the competition, about the amount of time that was left on the board. It had to have confidence in the ability, in the answers that it provided to create a lead. Watson needed to be able to understand speech and linguistics. It was, a language where it was developed and capabilities developed so that Watson could consume the information and then provide answers back. And finally, it needed, deep analytic capability and, natural language processing. It needed to retrieve information. It needed machine learning and, knowledge representation and reasoning. So all of these capabilities were built into Watson for this particular program. And, Watson actually beat the humans at its own game in this case, and was very, very successful. Now, Watson was developed primarily to demonstrate artificial intelligence, but it's also now being moved into business. We're seeing a lot of interest coming our way from organisations in health. We're seeing a lot of interest coming our way from organisations in education. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we're also doing work with financial institutions. And, we're now putting Watson technologies to work to help organisations, banks around understanding earnings. So, leveraging structured and unstructured, massive volumes of structured and unstructured data to understand the bank's earnings and where they can help improve the bank's earnings. Risk is a fairly obvious area for its use. When you think about, if we go back to GFC, there may have been a different outcome in some organisations if those organisations could actually blend the structured data that they were using to create VAR with all of the unstructured data that would have been available in the marketplace, that would have been sending warning signals about, the mortgage business and the housing market in America and the impact that it would have on, the larger banks' books. And finally, also around financial planning and helping, at a consumer level, helping banks provide a better advice to customers. So we're seeing more and more interest. We're getting a lot of interest from banks around this, and it's the ability to manage huge volumes of data, large volumes of data, near real-time analytics for structured and unstructured data. And the last slide, or the second last slide, is that if we go to that one, IBM gets a Wall Street job. IBM's Watson is, we're now working with Citibank so that Citibank can start deploying Watson-style capabilities in their organization. And this particular, when this became mainstream news, it also became a catalyst for other banks globally to start talking to IBM about its Watson's capabilities and how we can help banks across a number of dimensions of their business in managing big data and analyzing big data. So my final slide is, yes, IBM is firmly behind big data. We believe that big data is here. It's here now. And we believe that the banks that start thinking about and developing a Watson capability now will be the leaders in leveraging big data in the years to come. So that's it from me, Arun.
Thank you, Vince. Before I move on to the next presentation, two things. First of all, I would like to ask all participants to please send in their questions to the through their chat screen. And secondly, and Vince, before I go on, I want just in your article that you wrote for the one big question, you talked about the three aspects of big data: variety, velocity, and volume. If you could quickly just summarize that for our audience, then we would actually have the right base to step on the discussion afterwards.
Sure. So the three V's, as we call it, it's in terms of variety, it's the fact that traditionally, particularly in banking, it's very much around structured data. We have the transactional data. We have nice, neat packets of demographic data and account data. But today, there's more and more unstructured data that's coming into the organization. And this creates this variety of data that organizations need to manage. Velocity talks about time-sensitive data. Data that's streaming into organizations. For a lot of the banks that are beyond calls now, their treasury departments, their trading rooms, their internet banking, all of that is using real-time data. That data they need real-time streaming data to support that. So velocity is about how time-sensitive the data is. And then the volume is really just about the fact that big data, it's large. Enterprises are there's a lot of data inside our organizations. It used to be, not that long ago, we talked about, terabytes of data. Today I can go and buy a 1 terabyte disk, storage disk. So it's now moving towards petabytes. And it's creating, the volume is creating a huge challenge for organizations, including banks.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you. That's actually perfect. So thank you for that presentation in which you talked about Watson and how so much of analytics is going into creating such products and how this analytics can help banks. Now, I would like to talk to Edwin. Edwin has worked on tons of data for a long time with Standard Chartered and Bank of China. And Edwin, if you can hear me, we would like you to cover, as you had mentioned in your slides, how big data, what are the challenges that banks are facing with respect to big data, and what are the implementation challenges specifically. So it's over to you, Edwin.
Okay, I'll try to answer those questions at the end of my presentation. First of all, let me apologize to the WebEx participants. I was only able to offline hook up to the WebEx because of the bank's security firewall. And that also explains the attitude of banks towards data and towards external data that's being used in the bank environment. A bit of a background about Bank of China Hong Kong. We are one of the 3 note issuing banks in Hong Kong because Hong Kong doesn't have a central bank, and therefore all bank notes are printed by the commercial banks. And then the other 2 note issuing banks are, as you know, HSBC and Standard Chartered. We are also the 2nd largest bank in Hong Kong. after HSBC, and we are about 2/3 owned by Bank of China in Beijing, and we are also listed in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And because of that, our total asset size is about $220 billion that put us squarely in the big bank league within the Asian Bankers Survey. Let me go to slide number 2 to explain a bit our current thinking on big data. In terms of size, I'm just quoting particular reference to the specific area I'm responsible for on the Basel program. We are routinely processing data exceeding 5 terabytes, and according to Wynn's definition, is already in the big data league. However, all these processing are for two purposes. One is for regulatory reporting with Hong Kong Monetary Authority. The other one is actually doing internal portfolio analysis. And these two requirements does put us in a situation whereby we need to present very precise data both to the regulators and also internally to our senior management to identify where the risks are. And I actually, in slide number 2, I actually put in one word about the fuzzy logic. As you know that for big data, is usually we need to handle with quite a bit of unstructured data. And particularly when you go to Google to do the search, all you need to do is put in some generalized word. And in fact, you don't want to be too precise now. Otherwise, you will not be able to data mine those interesting topics available from Google and so on. But these are not relevant to us at the moment. As bankers, we are more focused on the data that we have in hand. We are also very much put emphasis on how relational database should be used to give us more precise information so that we can act accordingly. So I also put in slide number 3 to number 8 on the complexity of data that we handle under the Basel program. Unless participants will have more interesting in the detail on all these slides, I would rather go through them very briefly. So let's go to slide number 3, which shows that on the overall data architecture of the data that we process. On the left-hand side, we actually look at the rating sources consisting of corporate banking, retail banking, financial institution, and credit cards, and how these data would be processed and then put into what we call extraction, transformation, and loading area of the capital adequacy ratio engine, what we call the CAR engine, for further processing in order to generate the CAR report to be sent to the regulator, in our case, HKMA. Slide number 4, we also talk about how the data flow in a typical banking environment through the workflow system. From workflow, we divide it into corporate banking and retail banking, going through the rating process or scoring process, depending whether it's corporate banking or retail banking, and then put into a pooling. Pooling is a technical word for retail rating that has to be put into the CAR processing to generate the RWA calculation. Slide number 5, we look at more on the data warehouse architecture for different business in the bank. And on the left-hand side, we talk about the capital calculation, which is the one that we talk about in the CAR engine. We also talk about the retail banking side in terms of the data input, in terms of functional areas. And then on the rightmost side of the slide is the non-retail part, which is the corporate banking part. On slide number 6, we also look at the data flow in terms of before they flow into the CAR engine for RWA calculation on the sources of those data that is being used. They are not just frontline business data, but also data from other part of the bank, just like general ledger, the trading part, in terms of banking book, the failed trade, the buyback, bond impairment, and so on. those are typically what the bank actually transact on a day-to-day business in terms of their own proprietary trading and in terms of finance and accounting, into how data being recorded. And then we talk about specific provision and how the bank provide for their quarterly and semi-annual and annual report to be submitted both to regulators and also to the stock exchange. On slide number 7, we talk about our relationship with our parent bank in Beijing. Not only that we need to submit our RWA report to HKMA, we also need to submit part of our report to CBRC in Beijing for consolidation purpose. Slide number 8. Again, we look at the regulatory reporting and portfolio analysis. Now, this all meant to actually give you an insight on the use of big data in the bank. I think is not exactly within the bank's internal processing. On slide number 9, I also highlighted the potential applications of big data in the banking environment. From my perspective, I think there's quite a bit of potential for big data being used for banks to source potential customers. All right, because we are traditionally quite conservative. Remember, I mentioned about that I was unable to sign the Web Act because of security measure. So when banks trying to adopt particularly new technology and new thinking to do banking business, we usually take a wait and see attitude and see whether or not that idea is going to be mature into a business. I also like to comment a bit about the Asian Bankers survey about senior bigger banks. They tend not to be that much interested in big data, whereas smaller banks, they would like to explore opportunities. Because bigger banks, they already possess quite a bit of data. For them, the major challenge is how to do within their own customer base, explore opportunities where they can sell other products. For example, in the case of Bank of China Hong Kong, we have about 150,000 mortgage customers. We have about 3 million credit card holders. For us, already we have a rich database, a very much a structured database where we can explore opportunity, where we can do cross-selling, right, internally, rather than going out and try to mine data from unstructured data. Because by actually spending money or investing our money and time to do data mining on unstructured data elsewhere, I think the cost-benefit return is quite uncertain. We know that there's potential out there, but spending money in terms of getting more potential customers is a bit of a risk for us. For us, I think we put the money where we have already, for example, in our 3 million credit card holders, trying to explore them to see whether they can do mortgage business with us, whether or not some of these are owners of corporations where we can do corporate lending with us. I think that will be more beneficial to us in terms of spending money and investing money. And on top of that, I think I also want to draw two attention. One is about security, in the bank, and the other one is about Customer Privacy Act. We are not able to source data from other people, because there's in Hong Kong, for example, and in fact in most advanced economy, there's Customer Privacy Act in place, and therefore when we handle customer data, we need to handle with care, and then particularly for potential customer, we also need to handle with care. So that I think is another constraint that we have to look at in terms of trying to identify where opportunity for further business. And turning to slide number 10, I think one of the things that we like to consider is that is the big data technology mature enough for banks to adopt? And now, having what I said previously about data mining internally, the other consideration is that if we start to spend money today, all right, what will the return for us? Particularly, I also would like to emphasize on one point about what Vince mentioned about the dimensions in terms of variety, volume, and velocity. And hardware, computer hardware always actually advance much quicker than computer software. At this time, I know that if you buy servers, if you want to look at supercomputer, it's actually very much cheaper than what it used to be in terms of 5-10 years ago. But in terms of the technology driving these computers in order to identify potential customer data for us to use for business applications, I think at this moment is still taking a wait-and-see attitude. And overall, I also like to echo from one of the Asian bankers' research about why seemingly larger banks are less interested in big data than smaller banks. I think larger bank at this moment is already occupied with what they have internal in terms of data. Their challenge is how to do cross-selling. Whereas smaller banks, in order to try to gain market share on bigger banks, their focused attention will be whether or not there's some new avenue, particular new area they can explore in order that they can do better in terms of competitive edge. That's why when they hear about big data, they surely will be interested in it. Let me put an example about how I feel about technology. If you talk to people 10 years ago about web banking, it was in the embryonic stage. Nobody believed that we can do banking in the web. At that time, there wasn't enough technology to protect the data and also in terms of privacy of the customer involved. But over time, the technology mature, and you see that every bank today will actually offer some form of web banking to the customers. However, let's think that web banking is not all. And remember, and all commercial banks today, they will have a face-to-face interaction with customers. They have telephone banking with the customers. They also have web banking with the customers. So in a way, for banks, I think they will explore all the opportunity available to them to fill the need of the customers. And yet to say that one technology will actually replace the other, I think that may not be in the bank's expectation. So we are hedging our bets in terms of looking at various technology. We are looking at all the channels of marketing to our customers. We also monitor what the customer's preference would be and provide them with appropriate channel for doing business. That's my take about big data.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you. You made a lot of interesting points there. So let me just open the floor for discussion with you and Vince. And my first question to you, Edwin, based on what you just said, is you mentioned an analogy about the fact that web banking was not very popular 5-10 years ago, but now everybody has. So in big data, have we reached the inflection point where banks need to decide and invest now or do something now so as to gain first mover advantage? Is this the right time to do it, or is it too early? That's my first question. Yeah.
My view is actually I cannot say that I represent the whole banking industry. I will only say that represent typical large banks, in particular from a North Asian perspective, including China, rather than from ASEAN countries. Our view is that this is not the point of inflection yet. I think there's still some time to come. For us bankers are more pragmatic type, and we'll jump into the technology and use it when we see that the cost-benefit analysis justify the use of it. I think for us, we are not denying that the technology is important to us. Only we feel that this may not be the right time, maybe perhaps in the next couple of months or 1 or 2 years, and see how the pioneers would flare. For example, if you look at Google, Facebook, they are now doing all this unstructured data mining, and see where technology being used in all those pioneers will be mature enough to be used in the banking sector.
Vince, what do you have to say about the ROI for big data-based investments right now? How can banks be more convinced about looking at big data, not just internal big data as Bank of China already has, but for medium and small banks to start looking at unstructured external data, investment in understanding that data and the ROI associated with it? Vince?
The comment that was made earlier about you know, the cost of hardware and that, if you look at the you can actually see it in the article there on Citibank, but in Citibank it says that we're actually renting out the Watson services to Citibank. So I think there's a number of different ways that you know, we can look at how an organisation would go about acquiring, either buying or renting Watson-type capabilities. It's like a lot of these things. My view is that where does the client bank think they need some help around? Is it around improving the customer experience? You know, Edmund said earlier on, you know, cross-sell, upsell. Is it about gaining a better share of wallet, or is it about gaining, reducing my risk? In all of these aspects, there needs to be a process of dialogue between the organisations and look at, well, what is the problem? How are we going to solve the problem? And then look at the areas for potential payback. I mean, that has to be worked out before anybody's really going to embark on these sort of activities. The teams that we have committed to these programs are looking at, you know, where is a bank, or where is a health company, or where is an educational body going to get a return on their investment in Watson. So we would help organisations determine where the payback is.
So do you have any examples, Vince, you can share about the work that you do, maybe without naming clients, but success stories of or something that's upcoming which you see as a game changer in areas that you just mentioned, marketing or risk analytics, where big data is really playing a good part for a bank?
Well, it's early days. It's very early days for us, but we're very, very excited about what Citibank is planning to do around consumer banking. And you know, they're looking at it to help improve the customer experience and help you know, drive better revenues there. We have other banks approaching us too. So I think it's a little bit too early to sort of be able to give you explicit examples, but you know, things are moving rapidly. In 6 to 12 months' time, you know, if the client's willing, I think we'll be able to share some great examples.
Okay, so here's one question to both of you from one of our listeners, and this is Mark. Mark says, I find it interesting that banks for years have had customer data that most organizations would dream of. The Googles, Facebooks, etc. have monetized customer data. Do you see any classic financial institutions who have truly recognized the value of their customer data today? So Vince, why don't you go on first, and then Edwin, you can comment on that.
We have lots of examples of that, and there's a very good example of an organisation that's doing very well in that space in OCBC here in Singapore. So I'll use them as an example. But OCBC embarked on their sort of customer analytics journey early in the 2000s. They've invested in the technology, they've invested in the people, they've got some very good people in the team. They've invested in the process. It's an iterative process. They've learnt a lot along the way, but they are getting very, very good results as a team from what they call their consumer analytics group. I can't quote the numbers, but the numbers are significant. And I think they're a very good example of a bank here right in the middle of, you know, ASEAN that are doing it. There's a number of banks in Korea that are very good. You know, I think there's banks that have recognised that yes, they have all of this customer data. We need to harness it. What the more progressive banks are doing now is saying, how do I blend my structured data that I have in my organisation with the unstructured data that's out there? How do I take advantage of what people are saying, whether it be good or bad about me on Facebook, on Twitter, in blogs, and how do I use that to maybe build a better product or service, or fix up a product or a service.
Okay. Edwin, do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, from my perspective, I think the single most biggest potential available for big data will be consumer banking. To identify consumer, I think that's where the application will have tremendous potential in the future. But we also have to look at, in terms of consumer, I think from the banking perspective, I think we have a very close, what we call customer segmentation. Banks these days are actually chasing after private banking. Banks these days are chasing after wealthy customers. The reason being that they have the highest return in terms of the investment from a banking perspective. But you see, these customers, they require personal attention. They require a relationship manager to be attentive to them all the time. No? When you talk about trying to identify customers in the internet or Facebook or whatever, you are actually looking at generic customers. Those are not typically where your high value added customers. So it really depends on the bank's strategy. If they try to actually market some generic product to the mass market with a thin margin and yet heavy volume, I think that will be something that the bank should go after. But if banks want to be a bit more sophisticated and sell to their high-end customers, I think that there's no way that you can identify this customer through big data. Even you can identify them through big data, you still need to actually customize very special product for them to use. These are the kind of thinking in the banking environment. And therefore, I think, just as I've been quoted from OCBC, my view is that big data, I think, will be very suitable for regional banks like Citibank, where they have a sort of a center for product development and try to market, throughout the region on very simplified product where people can actually use those products, the internet. I think that will be the same formula. For banks with our size, actually very much concentrated in the Hong Kong market or some other locations, they already got enough channel where they can interface with the existing customer, particularly if they want to move up to the wealthy customers. I think big data will not be applicable to them.
Okay. So thanks, Edwin. My next question is, how do banks know if they're ready for big data? Is there an inflection point where they say, okay, we have achieved what we need from our internal data? Maybe that's not large enough right now, but with what data we have, the structured data, as Vince mentioned, we've achieved good enough. Now is the time to take the next step forward towards big data. So when do you think banks are ready for it?
I think what we can assess is that we usually have our market intelligence. We know that, for example, how much is our market share on mortgage in Hong Kong, how much market share we have for credit card business in Hong Kong. If we see that our competition is actually holding steady or we're gaining a bit on our competitors, I think there's not really big push for big data. If we see that our customers, our competitors, for example, they have they are actually gaining market share from us, then they will push for banks to actually look at elsewhere, outside the current customer base, to see whether they can gain more business with new customers, and that may push the bank into big data kind of search. At this time, I think Hong Kong and Singapore, I think, may be similar. It's very much a mature market. Those consumers or bank customers, they already have multiple banking accounts, multiple credit cards, and I think that we all know that that's not easy to gain any market share from competitors. However, in other regions, for example, mainland China, or even in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, or even Thailand, there are some rural areas where people, where customer can be gained if you actually have a way to reach them. So I would imagine that the point of inflection, I think, is something that when we monitor our market share is dropping, that will have an impetus for us to move in that direction, or we want to explore certain new areas where we want to expand our business, then big data is something also we can start on.
Vince, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, just following on from Edmund's last comment there, I think many of the banks in this region have regional aspirations. So you might think, well, yes, this is my country base, but if you take an organisation like CIMB, for example, who has probably the biggest branch network in Southeast Asia these days, their operations now are ASEAN and Asian operations. The three banks here in Singapore, the three local banks here, are extending their operations through Southeast Asia and Northern Asia. So that then opens up opportunities for larger customer bases, more deals, more volume, more velocity. In my view, it's those regional aspirations that these banks have is what's going to create the need for them to be able to look at unstructured data, and it's going to have a need for big data and big analytics. They will want to be able to sort of stay in tune with the customers, the market. They want to be able to manage risk and everything that the banks desire to do or may be doing well locally, they'll want to do on a regional basis. And I think that will be a catalyst for big data. I also believe that it's like a lot of these things that the banks need to be putting this on in their thinking, in their strategic thinking. It's always difficult to work out when is the exact right time. So you can either be a leader or a follower, but you don't want to be a big lagger in this space because I think it will impede your growth.
Okay, Edwin, do you see any regulatory challenges with regard to acceptance of big data within banks?
Yeah, I echo what Vince said. I think it's always a struggle for banks to whether or not we want to get ahead of our competition and spend quite a bit of money, or we are looking at in terms of waiting for the technology to mature, and when we spend a little bit less and then getting a bit more in our return in terms of ROI. This I think is two opposing forces that shape the bank's marketing strategy into the future. Usually from our point of view, in areas like Hong Kong or Singapore, where the banking is actually very much mature, and when you have to actually pay dividends to your shareholders every quarter, you will be more mindful about the bottom line, and therefore you need to be a bit more careful with your spending in technologies. And of course, look at a longer term. If you see that something that is coming, like big data, you will spend a little bit less at the moment, and then we'll try to increase that amount of spending over time to ensure that you are not being left behind from the technology and that of your competition, and at the same time making a sustainable ROI in the whole process. I would imagine that from bigger banks and from more mature banking locations, I think these are more or less at the banker's mind every time when there's new technology coming up for them to actually look at as an alternative avenue for delivering services to their customers.
Okay, so thanks, Edwin. So before we end, let me just come back to the original question about whether this is a consulting buzzword or a hype. So now, from both of you, last thoughts on whether there is too much hype on big data and is that driving banks away, or is there a need for education which would then push banks to put this item on their strategic agenda? What do you think? Last thoughts. Vince?
I would not say that it's a buzzword. I would imagine that this is something of a potential demand. How much of this potential demand will actually come to realization? I think everybody is different in terms of their journey to big data. I think more mature banks, more bigger banks, they will take a wait and see attitude. I think smaller banks may be ready to jump in if the product is simple enough and it can be easily delivered through the internet without having to put in too much personal attention. If a longer term market share is something they are looking at, I think that will be something that they will be looking at more closely than bigger banks.
Vince, your comments?
I think banks in this marketplace need to be exploring big data. There is no doubt that there is a need for some education, but it's certainly a great opportunity, in my view, for banks to get in there and start leveraging this data and using it for a competitive advantage. And the banks that are really successful in this space probably won't be running around waving their arms either, because they want to retain that competitive advantage.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this 1 hour. Let me just quickly conclude. So as a part of a poll, we realize that a majority of people agree that big data is a real phenomenon. There are differences with large and small banks and senior and middle management. However, things which look very sure are that there's a lot of data out there, which means there's a lot of opportunity out there. There's a lot of data which is structured within the organization and a lot of unstructured data. And as our panelists mentioned, I think there are large regional banks who might be the first candidates to pick this up and do, but that does not mean that others have to be laggards or followers. And it does look like big data needs to be, is definitely a term that is coined and is creating a lot of hype and not generating the amount of interest, maybe not generating as much amount of interest, but there is a need for banks to involve that in their strategic plans going forward if they need to remain competitive. So thank you once again. Thank you, everybody. We would be putting up the proceedings report of the teleconsultation session on the Asian Banker website. Thank you, everybody, once again for joining. Thank you to the panelists. And that's it from the Asian Banker.
Thank you, Arun.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.